This is how the first jet aircraft of the United States Air Force was meant to look. Not a machine, a dream out of the future, lifted from the screen of a science fiction film decades before anyone even knew how to shoot such a film. Sharp lines, a predatory silhouette, no propeller at all, and all of it came from a single man, whose name would later be spoken in aviation with reverence: Clarence Johnson, known as Kelly, chief designer of the Lockheed Company. The project carried the dry designation L-133, but behind those letters and numbers hid something that, for its time, bordered on audacity. A high-speed interceptor weighing 9 tons, born on paper in 1938, was meant to reach 1,000 kilometers per hour. 1,000. In an era when piston fighters struggled to approach half that figure. Do you grasp the scale of the ambition? This relates to a man who simply could not think within the limits of the possible. Lockheed pursued the work on its own initiative, with its own money, with no order from above, for 3 straight years. In that time, the engineers settled on the construction materials, on the layout, and blew a series of scaled-down models through the wind tunnel. The machine was taking on flesh. Only a single link was missing: the engine. A reliable, powerful turbojet engine that, in the United States, simply did not exist. The aircraft of the future slammed into the wall of the present, and then the Second World War broke out, and the country demanded not dreams, but a flood of production aircraft here and now. This relates to one of the bitterest patterns in the history of aviation. The boldest ideas almost always arrive too early. The project was shut down, the drawings were shelved, the experience of Johnson's team locked away in a drawer, it seemed forever. No one back then suspected that this folder would lie there only a few short years
and return at the most unexpected moment. The spring of 1943, the United States is behind shamefully, hopelessly, by years. In the skies over Germany, jet machines are already roaring. Over Britain, the same. And the greatest industrial power on the planet cannot present a single combat-ready jet fighter, not one. And then, from across the ocean, under the reverse Lend-Lease program, a British de Havilland Goblin turbojet engine is delivered to America. There it is, the lifeline. The thrust of this unit made it possible to build a real combat aircraft around it, not a toy, not a flying laboratory, an interceptor capable of fighting. This relates to a decision taken at the very top, with no right to error. The military set the condition harshly, in army fashion. 6 months, half a year, and not a day more. By the deadline, Lockheed was obligated to hand over prototypes ready for flight testing.
To create a high-speed jet interceptor from a blank sheet in 180 days? It sounded like mockery, like a deliberately impossible demand that only a madman or a genius would sign. Clarence Johnson signed. And here is where it gets interesting. Because this man had not earned his reputation as an organizational genius out of thin air. He did not ask, coordinate, or wait. He acted. From the firm's engineering staff, Johnson instantly pulled 28 men, the best. He added about 100 workers to them and sealed this group into an autonomous structure dependent on no one. No departments, no approvals up the chain, no paper bureaucracy on which any large corporation bogs down. This relates to a principle that would overturn the entire American aircraft industry. Everything the team needed, it received with a single telephone call. Material was required, a call and the material on the table. A machine tool was required, a call and the tool on the shop floor. Resources flowed to the group with no questions, no clearances, no signatures in triplicate. Speed became the only currency that meant anything there. And so that speed would not run into curious eyes. The project was hidden behind a thick veil of secrecy. What was being built in the tightly guarded hangar remained a mystery even to most employees of Lockheed itself. Only a very narrow circle knew. Everyone else could merely guess what machine was being assembled behind those walls, and why outsiders were not let in. This relates to the birth of a legend that would later receive its own name: Skunk Works. Back then, in '43, it had no name yet. There was only the deadline, hanging overhead like a verdict. There was the borrowed British engine,
and there was a handful of people who had to do the impossible, to catch up with a world that had pulled ahead in half a year. The clock started. 180 days on the table. The team finished in 142. Take a hard look at that figure. A combat jet aircraft that yesterday did not exist even in metal was built 38 days ahead of schedule, in an era when such machines all over the world were born over years. What it cost the people is a separate matter. Engineers and workers practically moved into the workshop, 14 hours at the drafting boards and machine tools, day after day, no days off, no right to fatigue. Some slept right at their workstations to avoid wasting time on the commute. This was not work in the ordinary sense. This was a siege in which the enemy was time itself. This relates to the atmosphere in which the machine was forged. The hangar was kept under heavy guard. What exactly was being assembled behind those gates was known only to a narrow circle of the initiated. From the outside, an ordinary factory building. Inside, the future of American combat aviation, laid out on the jigs and covered by the strictest secrecy. And then the machine took shape.
The designers made a deliberate choice. For the sake of manufacturability, the jet firstborn was brought as close as possible to the familiar piston brethren. No exotica that would devour precious weeks. An all-metal low-wing monoplane. A straight wing without any flourishes. A single fin tail of the classic layout. This relates to a configuration that solved several tasks at once. The cockpit canopy was made teardrop-shaped. The pilot had an almost all-around view. The landing gear was tricycle with a nose strut, which in those days was still considered a novelty, and the machine's main trump card hid in its nose. The engine went into the rear of the fuselage, and this arrangement freed the entire nose section. The designers did not miss the chance. Into the nose they crammed a powerful battery, 5 heavy machine guns of 12.7mm caliber, firepower able to saw apart any target of the time in a matter of seconds. This relates to that rare case when haste did not turn into botchwork. The machine came out coherent, logical, well-built. There was nothing superfluous in it, only what worked and what fired. A straight wing, a clean airframe, pure lines. An aircraft born under the pressure of an impossible deadline turned out to be beautiful as well. One thing remained, to lift it into the air. And here the calm part of the story came to an end. The finished machine was disassembled and in crates stamped Top Secret hauled to the Air Force testing range, Muroc Army Airfield. Here, in the middle of the California desert, the jet firstborn had to prove that 142 days of grueling labor had not been spent in vain. Early morning, the 15th of November, 1943. The fighter, painted in dark green, was rolled out onto the runway. Everything was ready for the historic moment. Around the machine, engineers, military officers, company representatives. The air rang with tension. And it was precisely at that moment that a warning sounded, one that could have changed everything. This relates to a voice that no one wished to hear. The representative of the British engine building firm, the very man who had brought the engine, looked the machine over and pointed to a small detail. The air intakes, in his opinion, were made of metal that was too thin, too flimsy for the loads about to crash down on the structure. The remark was made plainly, without hedging. It was ignored. The designers, absorbed in preparing the first run, brushed off the outside opinion. The goal was too close. Too much effort already invested to slow down over some Briton musing about the thickness of a sheet. The engines began to spin up. This relates to those seconds after which there was no longer anywhere to retreat. When the second engine was brought to take off power, the very thing they had been warned about occurred. Both intake ducts gave way. The thin metal tore loose from its mountings, and the airflow dragged the mangled intake straight into the turbine. Came the screech of metal being ground apart by the blades at furious revolutions. The engine was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. The inspection showed it unambiguously. The power plant was beyond repair. In a matter of seconds, the machine's only heart turned into a heap of twisted scrap. And here the true depth of the problem came to light. This relates to the catastrophic position in which the entire program now found itself. Other serviceable turbojet engines simply did not exist on the territory of the United States. Not a single spare. The machine stood on the runway as dead weight,
while the nearest usable engine lay on the other side of the Atlantic. A new unit from the Foggy Isle had to be awaited for 2 long months. 2 months of standstill for a project that, not long before, had run 38 days ahead of schedule.
The precious advantage won by inhuman labor evaporated over a sheet of metal that no one had cared to look at seriously. The aircraft made its first flight, later named the Shooting Star, only on the 8th of January 1944. A triumphant debut turned into a humiliating pause, and this was merely the first blow in a long chain of trials. On the 8th of January 1944, the jet Firstborn finally tore away from the Muroc runway. And from the very first flights it was clear, the machine was a success. The prototype showed excellent stability in the air. The handling, predictable, honest, free of the treacherous surprises that plagued so many early jet craft. Pilots, accustomed to skittish experimental machines, got an aircraft that obeyed the hand. And then came the record. Already on one of the first flights, the national speed record was broken. The Shooting Star became the first American aircraft to cross in level flight the mark of 800 kilometers per hour. 800! A figure that piston fighters could not even dream of. The United States, only yesterday hopelessly behind, burst at once into the top tier of jet aviation. This relates to a triumph that lasted exactly as long as the talk was of the airframe and the aerodynamics. The machine flew, the machine accelerated, the machine set records, but this triumph had a weak point, and it sat precisely in the rear of the fuselage, there where the unreliable jet heart was beating. The problem had a name: Allis-Chalmers. It was this firm that had been tasked with setting up licensed production of the British turbojet engine on American soil. The task seemed routine: take a finished design and copy it. In practice, it all turned into failure. The British unit proved too intricate, too fine a piece of engineering for the Americans to master on the fly. This relates to the gap between the drawing and the metal, a gap invisible on paper, but mercilessly exposed in the air. The first batches of engines left the factory gates with off-the-scale failure rates. They quit, stalled, broke apart. What with the British worked, if capriciously, at least worked, on American production turned into a lottery with a lethal stake. The picture took on a mocking shape. The airframe, beyond all praise. The aerodynamics, exemplary. The records, one after another. And the engine, for the sake of which the whole race with the British Goblin had been launched in the first place, turned out to be the weakest and most dangerous unit of the entire construction. The aircraft could fly faster than anything in America, but only until the turbine decided it had had enough. This relates to a pattern that would haunt the Shooting Star for many years to come. The machine was dragged down, not by any lack of talent in its designers, nor by errors in its airframe. It was dragged down by the power plant, which industry simply could not manage to perfect in time. Every record flight was at the same time a trial of luck. The leadership of Lockheed found itself facing a choice with no good options. To wait until Allis-Chalmers finally tamed the British design could go on forever, and time, as always in this story, was working against them. Germany and Britain were not standing still. Every month of delay meant that the gap, so painfully closed, risked reopening. This relates to a decision that would be made very soon. Lockheed resumed the search for an alternative power plant. The machine that had set the national speed record needed a new heart, and it would have to be sought where, only yesterday, there had been nothing. The recovery after the failure at Muroc turned out to be not calm, but a new and even deeper pit. The solution came from where it was least expected, not from across the ocean, not from British engineers, but from Native American soil. In the winter of 1944, the General Electric Company reported the completion of work on a deeply modernized jet engine. At its core lay that same British school, the design of Frank Whittle, the father of British jet technology, but refined and reworked already by American hands. Lockheed wasted not a minute. The very first examples of the new engine, designated GE-40, were immediately installed on a pair of pre-production fighters. There was nothing to lose.
The capricious licensed unit from Alice Chalmers had driven the program into a dead end, and the new domestic heart promised a way out. This relates to a decision that demanded recutting the machine almost entirely. The new engine proved larger and heavier than its predecessor.
To cram it into the existing airframe was impossible. Practically the whole fuselage had to be redone. An enormous volume of work, new units, a new weight distribution, and all of it under the same pressure of deadlines that had not released Johnson's team for a single day. The result silenced any skeptics. The modification bearing the letter A went onto the measured stretch and showed a fantastic 890 kilometers per hour. The machine became even faster, even more powerful, even closer to that very dream of 1,000 kilometers per hour with which it had all begun back in distant 38. On paper, an unqualified success. This relates to the part of the story that the victory reports preferred not to mention, because the reliability of the main units had hardly changed at all. The new heart was more powerful, but no safer. The engine still remained the most vulnerable point of the machine, and the reckoning for that followed without delay. Over the following 8 months, both test aircraft would be lost. Both, due to power plant failures. The machines on which the entire program had pinned its hopes, on which records were set and decisions were tested, departed one after the other. And along with the costly hardware, the trials took something far more precious. This relates to the heaviest line in this entire story. The loss of the 2 prototypes was merely a small part of the terrible price that the Air Forces of the United States would have to pay for the striving to field advanced aviation technology. That price was measured not only in heaps of scorched metal on the range, it was measured in people. The jet era entered the world not with a triumphant march, but with a procession of test flights after which not everyone returned to the airfield. Every new speed record stood on a foundation of risk, failures, and losses. The machine was beautiful and swift, but beneath its polished skin hid an engine that could not be trusted to the end. This relates to the cruel rule of the first jet generation, in force on both sides of the ocean. For the right to be first to master the new element, they paid in the highest of possible currencies. And the Shooting Star, for all its beauty and records, was no exception. It was advanced, it was fast, and it was lethally dangerous for those who lifted it into the sky. Alongside the testing, without waiting for the resolution of all problems, serial production unfolded. The military demanded machines in the ranks, and the logic of war left no time to first achieve perfect reliability and only then build. They built now, they perfected on the move, and they paid for it that very terrible price of which the parade reports said not a single word. Serial production was gathering pace without waiting for the testers to place the final period. By January of 1945, the first dozen interceptors had been assembled, 12 finished jet machines. For a country that just 2 years earlier had not a single one, this was a breakthrough. And the command reasoned simply, the novelty had to be thrown to where a real war was raging. 2 pairs from the first dozen were chosen to be sent to flame-engulfed Europe. The jet firstborn of the United States was finally to meet the enemy in the sky, those very German jet machines for the sake of competing with which the whole thing had been launched. On paper, a fine picture took shape. The American jet arrives at the front to inscribe its name into the chronicle of the war. This relates to the disappointment awaiting everyone who counted on a loud combat debut. The air war by that point had developed in such a way that there was simply no place in it for the Shooting Star. Enemy aviation displayed ever less activity. Allied aviation dominated the sky almost unchallenged, and there was practically no one left to fight. Add to this the strictest ban on flights over territory not controlled by the Allies. The command was mortally afraid of one thing, that the newest secret machine would be shot down or make a forced landing on enemy ground. A jet firstborn falling into the hands of the adversary, that was a gift no one could allow. And so the aircraft, having arrived at the war, was kept far from the real war. This relates to a precise parallel with the British. Exactly the same fate befell the English jet Meteor. It too was brought to the front, too was guarded, too was kept away from where it might fall to the enemy. The two first Western jet fighters found themselves in identical positions, the weapon created, perfected, delivered, and yet never allowed to be fully tested in battle. The war was ending sooner than a worthy target could be found for them.
Nor did the Shooting Star prove of use on the other edge of the planet, in the Pacific theater of operations. Here, the very nature of the machine played against it. Its modest range did not allow the jet interceptor to cover the gigantic ocean distances on which the entire Pacific War rested. And its appetite for the quality and length of runways turned basing into a headache all its own. This relates to a fundamental contradiction of the first jet machines. They were swift, but voracious, fast, but capricious about airfields. Where a piston fighter took off from a short dirt strip and ranged out hundreds of kilometers, the jet required a long concrete runway and constant refueling close at hand. On the island airfields of the Pacific, such conditions hardly existed, and yet the output of the aircraft grew without pause. The logic was ironclad. Even if the machine failed to fight today, it would become the foundation of air power tomorrow.
By the time of Japan's capitulation, the Air Forces already had more than 100 turbojet interceptors, a whole fleet of the newest hardware, which in this war never fired a single shot in anger. This relates to the attempts to somehow expand the machine's capabilities already in service. To combat the main trouble, insufficient range, the aircraft began to be fitted with additional fuel tanks on the wingtips. The solution was simple and plain. More fuel aboard meant more time in the air and a greater radius. These tip tanks would become the machine's calling card for many years to come. So the Shooting Star met the end of the Second World War in a strange position. Technically, a finished, formidable, record-setting combat aircraft. In fact, a weapon that had arrived too late for its own war. Its finest hour was still ahead, but for it the price would have to be paid in a different conflict and in entirely different blood. In the line units, the novelty was met without enthusiasm. The propellerless Hawk was received warily, with a clear measure of distrust. Pilots with hundreds of hours on piston machines behind them looked at the smooth, propellerless nose as if they had been handed something unnatural. An aircraft without a propeller seemed to them a machine that violated the familiar laws of the sky. They had to get used to everything at once. To the strangely placed tricycle landing gear with its nose strut, which altered the whole familiar picture of takeoff and landing. To the absence before their eyes of the spinning disc of a propeller, which for a piston pilot had been something like an anchor in space. The machine behaved differently, accelerated differently, braked differently. The old reflexes did not work here. This relates to a problem that could not be seen on any drawing. The chief difficulty proved to be the silence in the cockpit.
An almost complete, oppressive silence, where before there had always stood the roar of an engine. And it was not at all a matter of comfort. On a piston aircraft, the hum of the engine was the most important source of information. From a single change in tone, from the vibration, from the character of the sound, an experienced pilot instantly understood what was happening with the power plant. The engine began to run roughly. The pilot heard it before he had time to glance at the instruments. The sound was part of the controls, a sixth sense developed over years. This relates to the trap into which the jet era drove an entire generation of pilots. The turbine took this voice away from them. Now the pilot could not hear his engine. He could only look. Monitoring the work of the power plant had to be done by a whole scattering of needles and indicators on the instrument panel. The eyes, only yesterday riveted to the horizon and to the sky around, were now forced to dart across the dials.
This struck especially hard at takeoff and landing, where the count runs in seconds and where a mistake is not forgiven. It is in these very moments that the pilot most needs his full attention on flying, and instead, he was obliged to read off the instrument readings. The number of accidents grew without pause. The jet machine reaped its harvest not only in test flights, but in ordinary line units, in the hands of living, experienced men.
This relates to a line for the sake of which it is worth pausing in particular. One of the victims of the jet fighter was Major Richard Bong, not a rank-and-file pilot, not a novice. The most successful ace in the entire history of the Air Forces of the United States. A man who had passed through the fire of the Pacific War, who had downed dozens of Japanese machines, who had returned from the front alive and crowned with glory, a national hero. He was not undone by an enemy fighter, not by anti-aircraft fire, not by aerial combat. He was undone by a single, unswitched toggle. On takeoff, the most experienced of pilots failed to move the fuel pump switch to the required position. A detail, a trifle, the movement of a finger. That which on a piston machine might perhaps have been forgiven, here it was not forgiven. This relates to the cruelest irony of that era. An ace whom no adversary in the sky over the Pacific had been able to overcome departed this life on his native soil, in a peacetime test flight, over a single forgotten movement in an unfamiliar, demanding cockpit. The jet machine forgave no old habits. It demanded new thinking, new attention, new discipline, and it took its toll from those who failed to adjust in time. The loss of Bong became a symbol of this whole painful era of transition. The aircraft, born as a triumph of engineering thought, entered service life through a chain of losses and tragedies. And every such loss ate away ever more at the already fragile trust of pilots in a machine that had yet to prove itself worthy of the sky. The pilots' trust had been undermined, and Lockheed understood. Assurances alone would not bring it back. What was needed was a vivid answer that admitted no objection, and so the company took a bold step. It staged a demonstration tour. 3 specially selected machines were to prove by deed that the jet fighter was reliable. The result spoke for itself. Each of the 3 machines flew 500 hours without a single accident. 500 hours apiece, without one serious failure, without losses, without black lines in the reports. This was a direct and convincing argument. The machine was capable of flying long and safely, if it was properly maintained and properly flown. This relates to the moment when the designers gained a rare opportunity to calmly compare their creation with the best the vanquished enemy had possessed. After the war, the most perfected jet fighter of the Luftwaffe fell into the hands of the specialists, the Me-262, nicknamed Schwalbe. Comparative trials brought the 2 machines face to face, and their outcome gave very many people pause. By the pilot's own accounts, the German machine of the 1944 vintage showed itself surprisingly well. At a deliberately greater weight, the Me-262 possessed a comparable rate of climb, and in acceleration characteristics, it outright surpassed the American. The aircraft of the defeated country, created amid ruin and a shortage of everything in the world, proved, on a number of parameters, to be the better. This relates to an uncomfortable truth that honest engineers preferred to state plainly. The German school of jet aircraft construction in some respects ran ahead of the American one, and the comparative trials confirmed this in black and white. But the Me-262 had yet another indisputable advantage, far more important than seconds of acceleration: an ejection seat. The German machine gave the pilot a chance at salvation. In a critical situation, the pilot could leave the dying aircraft by firing the seat outward. The Shooting Star had no such capability, which meant that in the event of a failure at speed and altitude, far fewer chances remained to the man. The specialists of Lockheed did not reinvent the wheel. They copied the design of the ejection device and introduced it into a new modification that appeared in 1947. This relates to a new turn in the machine's development. The reworked aircraft received a strengthened airframe and a more powerful engine. But the main expansion of capabilities lay in the area of strike armament. Beneath the wing appeared mounts for 10 unguided rockets. From a pure interceptor, the machine was turning into a universal combat instrument, able not only to down aircraft, but to work over ground targets. Having built about 200 such machines, Lockheed officially reported the fulfillment of all obligations it had taken upon itself back in the war years. One might think the story should have come to a calm conclusion, but the customer's interest in the fighter did not even think of fading.
Moreover, the Navy took serious interest in fast jet interceptors, at that time in acute need of jet hardware. This relates to the reason the machine's production stretched far longer than anyone had planned. Thanks to the signing of a number of additional agreements, the production of the Shooting Star continued right up until 1951. The most mass-produced series of the jet became the C model. More than 1,000 such fighters served Washington in fighter squadrons scattered all over the world.
And closer to the end of the production cycle, Lockheed put forward an idea capable of granting the machine a second life. The aircraft was proposed to be fitted with a swept wing, which in theory promised a noticeable gain in maximum speed. The future models even managed to receive their own letter designation in advance on credit, but it was not their fate to take to the sky. Transonic interceptors of an entirely new generation were already going to trials, and they left the veteran not a single chance. Rehabilitated, reworked, armed to the teeth, the Shooting Star all the same remained a machine of a departing era. The machine that had arrived too late for its own war lived to see another. The true test for the Shooting Star became Korea, and this time no one kept the jet fighters away from the battles. On the contrary, the main bet was placed on them. By the start of hostilities, an imposing strike force had been concentrated at the airfields of Japan.
300 machines of this type, ready for immediate use. The command's design was simple and merciless. A jet fist of 300 aircraft was to roll like a steamroller over the enemy's aviation, sparse, outdated, built around the piston machines of a bygone era. On paper, it looked like a slaughter, and reality confirmed the calculation almost at once. This relates to the date that opened the machine's combat account. On the 27th of June, 1950, the Shooting Stars entered the fray. A flight of 4 American jets was patrolling the sky near the Kimpo airfield when 2 flights of Il-10 attack aircraft came into view. The enemy's piston machines had not a single chance against the jets. The fight proved fleeting. Without losing a single machine of their own, the Americans drove 4 enemy aircraft into the ground. A dry score, 4-0.
The jet era answered the piston era in the only language it understood, the language of speed, against which there was nothing to set. This relates to a pattern that repeated again and again in the first weeks of the war. The North Korean fighters were able to set very little against the Americans. The piston, Yak, and Lavochkin, only recently formidable machines, in the new reality turned into targets. The pilots of the jets acted coolly and with calculation. They did not get drawn into a maneuvering fight where the old piston fighters could still stand up for themselves. Instead, the Shooting Star pilots used their single but decisive advantage, a colossal edge in speed. An attack at enormous speed, a precise burst, a break from the fight upward and to the side, and the enemy could neither catch nor reach the American. The piston machines were shot up methodically on the pass, given no chance to impose their own kind of battle. This relates to a figure that shows the scale of this slaughter. By the middle of July, the result of the combat work was the destruction of 100 enemy aircraft. 100 of the enemy's machines, knocked out in a matter of weeks. The Northerners' aviation, sparse to begin with, effectively ceased to exist as a force capable of contesting command of the air. And here a new question arose before the command. The aerial targets had run out. There was simply no one left to shoot down. The sky over the front line had cleared. The formidable jet fist, created to exterminate the enemy's aircraft, was left without work in its direct role, and it was immediately retargeted onto the ground. This relates to the new role in which the machine had to prove itself. The Shooting Stars were switched to close support of the troops. The jet fighters went to pound the enemy's ground formations, columns, positions, nodes of resistance. And almost at once an unpleasant truth came to light. The heavy machine guns and the unguided rockets, of which the machine was proud, were entirely unsuited against the Northerners' tank columns. They could not pierce the armor. 5 barrels in the nose, terrifying in aerial combat, against armored hardware proved nearly useless. A different weapon was required, and it was found. This relates to the most formidable guise the Shooting Star assumed in the Korean sky. More and more machines began to go out on missions carrying tanks of napalm on their underwing pylons. The fiery mixture did not discriminate over armor. It burned away everything in its path: tanks, infantry, hardware, shelters. That against which bullets and rockets were powerless could not withstand a wall of fire. And here the machine showed itself in all its merciless effectiveness. Napalm strikes erased whole companies and battalions of the enemy.
They made practically impossible any movement of reinforcements during daylight hours. By day, any column on the road turned into a perfect target. The enemy was forced to hide and to move only under the cover of darkness. This relates to an admission that must be made plainly, without reservations. In the first months of the war, the Shooting Star, despite the complete absence of armor and, as a consequence, its high vulnerability to fire from the ground, proved an extremely useful and effective weapon. The machine would burn from a single lucky hit by an anti-aircraft gun, and yet time after time it returned to its missions. The share of this type of aircraft in certain periods reached up to 70% of the total number of all combat sorties. 70% of all the combat work, on the shoulders of one single machine. A veteran, born back in the years of the Second World War, was dragging the main weight of a new war upon itself.
This was its finest hour, its genuine triumph. The jet steamroller was working at full power, and it seemed that this machine had not and could not have a worthy rival in the Korean sky. So it seemed, right up until one autumn day. The easy stroll for the pilots of the Shooting Star came to a sudden end, the 8th of November, 1950. This date entered the history of world aviation forever, and it entered in blood. On that day, a patrol of 3 flights of American jets was loitering over the Yalu River. Familiar work, a familiar sky. And suddenly, out of the clouds toward them, dove a machine that no one here had been expecting. A swept wing, an unfamiliar silhouette, a monstrous speed. A Soviet MiG-15. For the first time in this sky, 2 jet fighters of opposing sides came together. This relates to a moment that had no precedent in the entire history of wars. The fight flared up in earnest. Both the Americans and their adversary fought blind. Neither side had even an approximate idea of what the opponent's machine was capable of. This was a clash not only of pilots, but of 2 design schools colliding head-on for the first time. In the course of a battle that lasted only a quarter of an hour, one Shooting Star crashed to the ground. The Americans, for their part, laid claim to one downed MiG. So categorical a position from both sides is entirely understandable. For, from a historical standpoint, the aerial duel of the 8th of November became the first battle in history in which manned jet hardware took part and suffered losses on both sides. Whose side to take in the dispute over the score, let each decide for himself. This relates to a conclusion that was beyond doubt for anyone. From now on, in the hands of the opposing sides lay an extremely dangerous instrument. The era in which a jet fighter shot up piston small fry with impunity ended in a single day. An equal had appeared in the sky. And this equal, as would very soon become clear, was not equal at all, but superior. The pilots returning from that sortie kept repeating one and the same thing. The aircraft unknown to them, with its swept wing, possessed a significant superiority in power to weight. It climbed faster, accelerated faster, held its speed better in a maneuver. The only thing in which the Shooting Star could still vie with the new opponent was the horizontal maneuver, where the Americans' straight wing gave a small advantage. But in a jet fight, where everything is decided by energy and speed, this was catastrophically little. This relates to the swiftness with which the losses came pouring down. On the 27th of December, yet another Shooting Star was shot down in aerial combat. The machine that only half a year before had reigned unchallenged in the Korean sky was now itself becoming prey. And just a week later, 5 aircraft at once failed to return to their airfield. The count had begun to run, not in single units, but in flights. But the heaviest line in the chronicle of Clarence Johnson's jet Firstborn became the 12th of September 1951. On that cloudless autumn day, the contrails of nearly 200 aircraft were traced across the sky over the front line. The air was literally seething with the machines that had come together.
This relates to one of the largest jet battles of that war. About 80 MiGs came down upon roughly 100 shooting stars in an unprecedented aerial melee. Dozens of machines circled in a deadly carousel, stitching the sky with tracers and contrails. When it was all over, the result proved merciless. On the ground remained 3 Soviet machines and 15 American. 3 against 15, a ratio that left no room for illusions.
And although a number of English-language sources to this day treat this statistic with skepticism, disputing the specific figures, there is a fact that speaks louder than any arguments over the score. The mass withdrawal of the Shooting Star from the theater of operations that followed indirectly but eloquently confirms the machine, in the role of a fighter, had lost its war in the Korean sky. This relates to the cruel speed with which the combat aviation of that era grew obsolete. The aircraft that had been the summit of progress only a few years before turned in one single year into an easy target for a new generation of machines. To rearm the units onto the more modern Thunderjet and Sabre instantly was impossible. That required time, which there was not. And so the Shooting Star was not written off entirely. It was returned to what it could still do. In the role of a jet attack aircraft, the machine continued to be used throughout the rest of the Korean War. Departed from the role of a fighter, it still pounded the earth with napalm and rockets, doing the dirty, dangerous, and necessary work. By the time hostilities ended, only one group in a National Guard squadron still flew it, the last echo of a once formidable armada of 300 machines. This relates to the quiet sunset that awaited the veteran after the Great War. The aircraft lingered in service until 1958, after which it was sold off to countries loyal to Washington. And in the air fleets of a number of states in Latin America, the last Shooting Stars held on right up to the middle of the 1980s. The machine that had opened the jet era for its country and had lived through the first battle of jet fighters in history lived out its days under a foreign sky, on the far margin of the world, long forgotten by those who had once placed their chief hopes upon it. Any account of Clarence Johnson's first jet aircraft would remain incomplete without the chief paradox of this whole story, because true immortality was brought to the machine not at all by its combat career, but by its modest training modification. And this, friends, is a turn that no one had expected. Lockheed thought ahead. Even while the fighter was only just entering service, the company reasoned rightly. Demand for training aircraft would inevitably grow in the future. The jet era was coming, and thousands of young pilots would have to switch from piston machines to jets. Someone had to teach them this, and to teach them on something. Lockheed decided to offer the military a 2-seat training variant of its production machine. This relates to an engineering solution, simple and elegant. To fit a place for a second pilot instructor, the airframe was lengthened by 1 meter.
For this, a price had to be paid. The fuselage fuel tank was reduced, and the armament was cut down to a modest pair of heavy machine guns. But for a training machine, this was a more than reasonable price. The flight trials went smoothly and revealed no significant problems. In 1948, the 2-seater was officially recommended for production. And here began that which surpassed all conceivable expectations. The figures of this success are worth setting side by side to feel the full scale of the contrast. This relates to a comparison that speaks for itself. Combat fighters of all modifications were produced to the number of about 1,700 units, and training machines on their basis were assembled, take note, 6,500. The training 2-seater overtook its combat progenitor by nearly 4-fold.
The modest aircraft for teaching novices proved more needed, more in demand, and more durable than the formidable Interceptor for the sake of which it had all been begun. The machine went all over the world. The training 2-seater was supplied to the air forces of 36 states. On it learned to fly countless generations of young pilots, and in nearly every one of them it left the warmest of memories. Obedient, reliable, forgiving of a novice's mistakes, it became a true flying desk of the jet era, the machine on which a man for the first time in his life lifted a jet aircraft into the sky. This relates to a figure that is hard to believe. The service life that the designers had built into the airframe proved truly colossal. There is a known case in which a machine, produced in 1959, was sent into well-earned retirement only in 2005. 46 years in service. Almost half a century of continuous, accident-free duty over which the aircraft spent 11,500 hours in the air. And by this, perhaps, everything is said. Let us then draw a line beneath this story. The Shooting Star is, beyond all doubt, the most successful jet aircraft of the first generation. Not the fastest, not the most formidable in battle, but the most viable, the most needed, and the most durable of all its contemporaries on both sides of the ocean. This relates to an honest summing up that cannot be passed over in silence. Developed in tight, almost impossible timeframes, it, like all its European competitors, carried within it a considerable number of the errors typical of that early era. A capricious engine, an absence of armor, the growing pains of a whole generation of hardware, all of this was there. There is no getting away from it, and an honest account is obliged to mention it. And yet the main thing about this machine is something else. The labor, the talent, and the persistence that its creators invested in their work were, in the end, transformed into something truly valuable. Into a reliable, well-deserved, and simply very beautiful machine, which honestly served its term and which need not be ashamed of the life it lived. The aircraft, born under the pressure of an impossible deadline, in the end outlived nearly all of its peers and went to its rest with its head held high. Friends, with this our story comes to an end. Thank you for being here and for watching through to the finale. Peace to all, and we shall hear one another again very soon. Friends, if this story gripped you, support the channel. Leave a like. It is the best thanks for our work and a signal that you want more material like this. Subscribe if you are not yet with us, and be sure to hit the bell. That way you will not miss a single new episode. Ahead lie many more forgotten machines, secret projects, and closed pages of military aviation. Write in the comments which aircraft we should cover next. Until we meet again in the sky,